The Supreme Court is facing more difficult political questions this week with a resurfacing debate about affirmative action. Monday, the High Court heard cases from both North Carolina and Harvard University about the necessity of race-based college admissions. Here to talk about affirmative action and its role in Louisiana is political analyst Jim Engster. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Good to see you.
So let's start with the basics. Can you explain what affirmative action is and how long have Americans been acquainted with this concept?
It's been part of the fabric of American life now for more than 6 decades. We're going back to President Kennedy, who was the 35th president. Now we're on number 46. So we've got a lot of people who've been around on the Supreme Court and in the White House, and affirmative action has been part of the rule of the land, but there are some who say it's outworn its welcome. And now we have these cases before the High Court to determine whether it's necessary in higher education to have a diverse student body, and many believe it is. In Louisiana, for example, our colleges and universities are not reflective of the 1/3 African American population that is present, and affirmative action is a consideration for enrollment. But the Supreme Court is highly conservative now, and it appears they're on the brink of changing this. The question is how much.
So how exactly does affirmative action work on college campuses? I mean, you hear that it's supposed to help bring in minority students, but how does it actually do that?
There's more than grade point averages, as we know, and test scores. And so already on campuses, we let people in who are great athletes who may not have the highest scores as other people. And in affirmative action, we might enroll a person of color, a Hispanic person, an Asian person, a black person, to get some kind of racial diversity on campus who might have a slightly lower score than somebody from the majority race. And that's been the rule of the land for many years. In 2003, the Supreme Court said that's what should be done. But now with 6 conservative justices appointed by Presidents Bush and Trump, and the first Bush with Clarence Thomas, then it's a case in which the numerical numbers, the numerical majority would indicate that it's likely to change, and the Supreme Court could split the baby and have some kind of compromise ruling on this. But it appears that affirmative action as we know it is on the way out.
So in Louisiana specifically, I mean, what's our relationship with this concept?
Well, in Louisiana, back in 1961, when President Kennedy had the first executive order on affirmative action, we had a handful of black students at the universities in the state other than the historically black colleges and universities. So much has changed since then. We know that. But nonetheless, with 1/3 population African American in our state, there are not 1/3 African Americans on campus. And the question is, where do you draw the line? Because some believe that we should have 1/3, others believe that we should have at least half that. And sometimes in order to achieve those goals, we have to take other factors into consideration other than grade point averages and test scores.
All right, so really it's just a numbers game at this point.
It's a numbers game, but the Supreme Court doesn't like this numbers game. They would like a colorblind society, and I think everybody would, but the reality is we are aware that we're not in a colorblind society, that race does matter in all facets of human life, and certainly on college campuses. And some consideration as to enrolling a person of color is something that's been around. There's several precedents for it for 6 decades. But the question is now whether this will apply. And the Supreme Court, for example, has a dilemma about service academies. We want a diverse military, but suddenly if affirmative action is not available for West Point and the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy, then we're going to have a more white military. And that's something that I think most people would say is not good. But the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, is going to make a change, it would seem almost inevitably, and we'll see how far they go.
All right, and I believe that is where we were left last week, is that just waiting, just a waiting game at this point to see what will happen.
It's a waiting game, but the numbers are there with 6 Supreme Court justices out of 9 who are conservatives, including the Chief Justice John Roberts, who is moderate on other issues like Obamacare, which he voted to uphold. It seems almost a certainty that something will change, and the question is whether the Supreme Court will go all the way and just say no more affirmative action, or whether they will say affirmative action is okay in these cases. We're going to find out.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us again this week.
Thank you, Kara.